thank you to our panelists for coming. We have a distinguished panel here that's going to discuss some questions having to do with education. Now that we've heard about housing, one of the other great issues of our time here in British Columbia. Thank you, Charlie, for you and your staff putting together this meeting, and thank you very much for your introduction of all of us, including myself. I'm happy to be here today because primarily the topic, the theme of the conference, coming together so that we can learn more about communities for all. Okay. There's more here. And as a career educator, I'm of course proud to be a part of one of the places where we learn community most deeply and earliest, that is the public schools. Like many of you, myself and my children have gone to public schools, and also like many of you, I have worked in the public education system. In my case, it was my entire career. This is a moment of hope for progress in public education in British Columbia. And I want to be sure to say that in the last, 8 months, I heard Stephanie say, and Selena say, excuse me. In the last 8 months, I felt we have a government that cares about each and every one of us. And I have to say, I came in 2003 to British Columbia, and I hadn't felt like that prior. And I hope that the current government can make that message clear to the people of British Columbia, because there's going to be mistakes made and there's going to be criticisms. The problems are very difficult. But it matters a lot if the problems are dealt with in a spirit of helping all of us, even the least among us, and not favoring those of great wealth or of great influence, as happens in many political segments in society. So the format today is I'm going to ask 2 questions right now, and each of the members of the panel is free to respond to them briefly, 2 minutes or less. Then we're going to hear from the minister. Then we're going to collect questions from you. Erin, where are you? Erin is the person in the back of the room. She'll come around and collect the questions. And then the last thing we'll do is Charlie and her staff will select from those questions so we get some sort of a balance in topics that are addressed. And you'll have another chance to hear from the panel as a group. So the first question I'm going to ask the panel, and I'll start and go around. And as I say, you don't have to respond to each question. Some of them might be a little more appropriate for you than others. For over 16 years, many of us feel that the former government did not provide adequate increases to the operating budgets and capital budgets of our schools. Do we need a real increase in budget for capital and other expenses that are beyond the Supreme Court mandated faculty increase? Rob? Sorry, Dan. Give it to you right between the eyes.
Great to adventure. Well, first of all, it's a great question to lead off with. I want to just begin by thanking the Columbia Institute, because for so many years at gatherings like this and rooms like this, we have been talking about the underfunding of public education. The Institute has talked about how what British Columbia needs to be a sustainable, prosperous jurisdiction is really a K-16 strategy with significant investments in early childhood education. And when we look back to budget 2018, all of 2 months ago in February, you're seeing that. $1 billion invested over the next 3 years in early childhood education, $550 million lift in the K-12 education system over the last full funding year of the previous government, 2,900 new spaces in post-secondary education, really the largest seat expansion for young people in over a decade in British Columbia. So it is significant, as you heard from Minister Robinson earlier. Major breakthroughs on areas where the previous government absolutely failed. 5 years of a divisive referendum in the Lower Mainland with no significant investment in public transit, no moves towards smart growth. So on a number of key files that are critically important and on an agenda that this institute has championed for many, many years, it's nice to see that we have moved in British Columbia from an austerity agenda to a progressive government that is investing in people, families, and communities. And the answer to the question around additional funding is yes. And I think the process for deciding on what funding should look like for 21st century education, how funding should align with, for example, the new curriculum in British Columbia, the answers are going to come from the first K-12 funding review that this province has had in over 25 years. And that process is already underway. It's gathering in communities and regions right around British Columbia, and it's posing the key questions that this organization and British Columbia, the parents groups, teachers associations, and others, support staff unions have been asking of the previous government for years, and we never got any action on that. We had an imposed funding formula in 2002 that was predominantly around a per pupil allocation that didn't suit the needs of suburban, fast-growing communities. It didn't suit the needs of rural communities that saw over 200 school closures, and it didn't support the needs of inner-city districts like Vancouver. So we're posing the right questions. We have the right people at the table, and I think in our next budget, budget 2019, for example, we will have the benefit of this review, I think, to answer exactly what the best formula looks like for British Columbia. Other jurisdictions have reviewed it. Our counterparts in the OECD have also changed the way they make allocations for education, and I think that's where British Columbia is headed as well.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. I want to echo Paul's comments about the changing government, and I would say from being in a school district where it feels more positive than it has for years, specifically 16 years, and so I would like to echo those comments. The Teachers Federation is certainly looking forward to the funding review. The per pupil funding model has caused lots of problems, especially given some of what's happened in secondary school and around the curriculum over the last 12 to 14 years in terms of how funding occurs. And clearly, we would agree that more funding is required. If we look at total expenditures on public education, I think in 2001, total expenditures were about 20% of the government spending, and it's now down to 12%. So, of course, there's arguments that more money is being spent, but when you look at it as a proportion of government spending, it's decreased considerably, and we've seen that decreased services and access to the kinds of supports that all of our students need.
That's a simple answer, yes. But I think it's a little bit more nuanced, and I'm glad you brought up the funding from the review because specifically you talked about capital, and I think that we do need more money in capital because our capital funding hasn't been increased in years, and the current funding formula is focused just on our operating budget. But I would argue that there's not a school district in this province who isn't actually funding some of their capital out of their operating because of inadequate capital funding. And so I really encourage the minister to ensure that these two things are looked at together and not as separate because they're deeply entwined. How we educate our students and where we educate them are deeply entwined. So I think that it's really important that we take that on. And we have seen an increase in our budgets in the last little while because of the Supreme Court ruling, and we are all grateful for that extra staff and those teachers in our districts. But I think what we really need to do is be able to have the ability at the local level to make nuanced decisions that are specific to the needs of our district. And so how we're able to do that, whether that's through more money or other means, I welcome the changing government for us to be able to have these really complex and necessary conversations.
I think that it really isn't just a matter of more public education dollars. It's also about, are we using the money that we have in a smart way? And is it effective? I think that, yes, we're looking at a funding model review, but it's not just about how do we distribute the pie we are already getting fairly or more fairly. It's really about what kind of a pie, how big of a pie do we really need? You mentioned the Supreme Court ruling, and I think that that's one of the challenges that we have when it comes to, we're hearing in the media that there's been so much money put in because of the Supreme Court ruling. But when you think about 16 years and you think about the services and supports that our students have, things that districts have made, decisions districts have made on what they need to cut to maintain the services and supports to students, some districts have made conscious effort to maintain teacher ratios. And because the Supreme Court ruling put money back in based on teacher ratios, there were districts who had made choices to maintain supports for students who actually got less money for people than districts who made other decisions. And those are the types of conversations we really need to have about, but what are those things that we haven't been addressing? There's districts who cut custodial services. There's districts who cut supports EAs. There's districts who have had to find other ways to fund operational costs by having international students. Those are things that districts have worked really hard to find innovative and unique ways to fund a system that we're not funding through our report dollars. So we're really pleased to see the work that the ministry has been doing and the conversations we've been able to have to look at those creative solutions.
So my name is Reyna, and I'll just share quickly what Fresh Voices is. So we're a group of immigrant and refugee youth from different parts of the world. There's Colombia, Philippines, Syria, and many more. What we do as an organization is we bring migrants, so migrant communities all over BC, and we put them pretty much in the same room as everyone in here. So we put them in the same room as policymakers, stakeholders, and different institutions to discuss and address the challenges that migrant communities are facing. And from those several workshops and dialogues, education has been a recurring theme. So a lot of young migrant and refugees have been facing challenges in the education system. And I guess to shortly answer the question about budget increase, I think there should be a budget increase. And when the ministry considers planning the budget, there should be a closer look at how education has affected migrant communities, because they have such a unique experience, and to target on specific strategies. The concern would be, how do we prepare newcomer students in graduating, and how should we also prepare them for to enter the market? And one of those strategies that we've thought of is to review the policies of graduation, and it specifically is to credit ELL for graduation, because many of the students across BC don't get credited for the English learning for the English class that they take. And a part of the specific strategies that we've thought of is to provide consistency all throughout BC, so a unified form of assessment all throughout BC.
Thank you. That's it. The immigrant and refugee youth are a topic close to my heart, because I was part of Friends of Simon, which is now in its 12th year at SFU, that trains college students to go out as tutors and work with such young people in our schools. We work with thousands in these 12 years. The second question that we have is about special education. Are we meeting the needs of all our students? The full per capita funding of certain special education only schools by the former government looks like the beginning of privatized special education in BC. Do you think this is where we're headed?
My answer would be no, but yet again, we're finding an area where the previous government's policy directions, the consequences of a number of their actions around underfunding certain areas of the education system. We find ourselves as a new government fixing messes. And one of the reasons, I go back to the funding review just briefly here, is that we're looking at a new funding regime between ourselves and our partners, the boards of education, is to look at all of the pillars of student success, student achievement that we have to improve in British Columbia. The previous government is very complacent to, quite frankly, rest on the good work that professional teachers have done throughout our school system that results in very impressive, for example, international student comparisons and success rates. They were happy to just sort of see a general evolution to a higher graduation rate as one indicator of student success, but they really didn't look at the last sort of 15% of students that the system doesn't serve well. That includes special needs learners. It includes certain populations of new Canadians, and it most certainly includes Indigenous students, and especially in terms of a subgroup, children who are in the care of the ministry. So what we're trying to do as a new government is focus on the most vulnerable learners in BC right now, because that will help boost the satisfaction and the achievement levels in the school system overall. Special education is going to be a major focus of the review that we're doing, And there is no consensus, quite frankly, about where we should drive new investment, whether we should double down and have a more sophisticated, variated system of categories for different types of learning designations, or whether we should have something that maybe is more suitable to an education team inside a school that works with the needs of learners that have been identified as needing additional support. So those kinds of things are going to be determined, but I think we need to review what you've been doing, look at what other jurisdictions are also doing, listen to professional teachers, support staff, and others in the school system to drive the change that we want to make. Because we want a vision that is going to carry us decades into the future, not merely fixing literal mistakes in the most immediate previous year.
All citizens of British Columbia need to ask themselves, because I think it was mentioned earlier, I think by Charlie, that we're at a crossroads. And I think I would say the same thing in terms of public education, that if the Liberals had won the last election, I would think public education would be on its absolute last legs. That I think many of us are feeling the foundations are very, very shaky. And we've seen an enormous increase to private schools in terms of funding. And Bob's heard about this from us lots before, so he's nodding his head, and you'll hear the teachers go again. But really, it's, we're funding private schools to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in British Columbia, and there is only so much money in the pie for any one service, and that's the way it is. You can't spend, infinitely on any service, but when you decide that you want to fund private enterprise or private organizations with public money, I think that's a real values question that people need to be asking themselves. So we for sure have seen the increase in privatization. I live in East Vancouver. Many of my neighbors now send their children to private schools, and I can see the diminishment of community, and everyone here is interested in talking about community. Public schools are part of that community. So I think that's a really big question that needs to be looked at for special education students, perhaps specifically, but in fact, for all of our students.
Thanks. In terms of your question, do you think this is where we're headed? I think my answer may have been different a year ago than it is now. And I'm encouraged by the minister's answers, and really the only people who know the answer to this question is government, and I'm encouraged to hear that this is not a direction that they are willing or want to take. It's such a complicated question when it comes to special education, and no one can fault a parent for making choices to meet their students' needs. If you're a parent and you have the ability to make choices, you will move mountains to ensure that your child is successful. And I don't want to take away from or make a parent feel bad for making those choices if they have the ability to make them. And that's the fine line there, is if they have the ability to make them. And in public education, our job is we open our doors and we take everyone. That's what we do. And we have to make sure that we can provide a robust and responsive system that meets the needs of every single student. So the question really needs to be about what is causing the rise of these schools. Why is it that we are not able to meet their needs? And we have a moral imperative and responsibility to meet the needs of those students. So it's, hearing the funding formula review, and I'm looking forward to seeing us being able to unpack these things now and have some time to unpack these questions to make sure that we are creating a system that meets the needs of those students so that people don't feel the need to take their students somewhere else. And also, the people who are in the schools have the ability to have equitable access to a system that will ensure good opportunities for them in the future.
I want to echo what Stephanie said. I think that to dial it back a bit, as a parent of a special needs child, to make that decision to leave public education, that's a really tough decision for a lot of parents. It's not a choice they wanted to make, but really, if a system is failing you, I think a lot of parents in the last 16 years have felt that way. If you're not getting the support you need for your special needs child, and I've been in that position, I do have children with special needs, it's not something you take lightly. So it's something that, like I said, it's when the system's failing you, you do try to find a way to make sure that your kids are receiving the support they need. I think that's where we have that opportunity right now to really assess how you're supporting kids. Rather than the top-down model where it's based on designation, the inclusive education review, we have that opportunity to look at things differently. What are the needs our kids have? How can we use a needs-based model to address the services that they require to be able to reach their potential? Every child has a different potential, and recognizing that we are all different and we need to support everybody where where they are is something that we as a society need to really address. I think that when we look at supports based on need, there are districts in this province who've done a really good job of identifying needs in their classroom, identifying needs in their schools. I think that sometimes it's also not just individual students. Sometimes classrooms need support. I think that we need a flexible funding model that's responsive to the unique and changing needs of teachers, support staff, individual students, and also the needs of the classroom as a whole.
To answer that question is, I hope not, and I'd like to stay positive that way. I like where you're going at really addressing the challenges that the students are facing, but how can we address those if there aren't people from that community represented? Like if we really want to know how to not go into that direction, then we need more people from different communities, like migrant communities, indigenous communities. We need more students to talk about the challenges that they're facing in the education system. And one of the strategies that we'd like to do is to bring different migrant communities, so that we can share the challenges and how we can move forward. And one of the things that we want to work on is to have more settlement workers in schools, so that the children, immigrant, and refugee youth are properly supported. Because some of them end up translating for their parents to their teachers. And that's an add-on burden to those youth.
Thank you. The next item on the program then is to hear from the minister for a few minutes, and then we'll return to questions from the audience.
I want to just emphasize some of the things that the government is working on that we think are going to pay significant dividends around the investment we're making in K-12 education and provide a bit more of a vision going forward about what we set as expectations for our school system and how we can better support families and communities right across British Columbia through the schools that are so integral to those communities. I started to mention in one of my responses about our area of focus being around vulnerable student populations that have not perhaps been as well cared for in the school system as they ought to be. And that is the focus that our government has right now. That is the challenge we put to school leaders in the districts, and that is where we see quite a variation in terms of how well some school districts are doing relative to others. And it's not about, ranking schools, as the Fraser Institute does, to distort the meaning of the kind of education that happens inside of communities. It's about helping districts that are underperforming in certain parts of the province raise their game to the level of districts that are, I don't want to say overperforming, but performing excellently in their respective jurisdictions. So when we talk about throwing out the challenge to school districts, saying, by a certain year, we're thinking 2025 might make sense, working with our friend Mike Barker at the Dogwood 25 Institute to achieve parity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in every measure of student achievement. We can look to a number of districts that have already accomplished that. Sea to Sky School District is one district that deserves to be singled out for the relationship that they have built with First Nations communities and the kinds of supports they've added in the school system to erase that distinction. And that's what we need to do in every part of British Columbia. When it comes to new Canadians, for example, some communities are doing exceptionally well in our school system and others are not. That suggests that, yes, we need to work with other agencies and departments of government to do better, but it also goes back to the question of what are the kinds of right resources that will help more students succeed. And then we get to the area around special education. And we know that the diagnoses for special needs learners are not likely to decrease. We seek greater understanding across the school system to better adapt the commitment and promise around individualized learning in our school system. And again, we're going to have to invest in professional development for teachers and support staff. We're going to have to encourage superintendents, school trustees, and others to use the kinds of classroom resources that we anticipate and indeed are investing into the school system right now to be targeted at those kinds of learners. And you know what? I have to say that the conversation that we're having right now in the school system is very collegial and collaborative. It's well supported by those who have labored in the system for a long, long time. And we concluded the previous section with some comments on private schools, and I know that's of interest to a lot of people in the audience, and I'll just make a comment on that myself. The reason why people fled from the public system over the last 16 years to private schools, and it grew from about 8% of the student population to 13%, I think there are two reasons. One is the government locked out and disrupted schools in the public system time and time and time again. And I can remember parents, because my kids are involved in public education, telling me, like in the fall of 2014, for example, I can't afford to have my kids in the public school system. I'm self-employed or I'm employed in the service sector. There are no days off. There are no child care provisions that I can have. So the disruption, the unpredictability that the Liberals brought onto the public school system was probably the main driver in why my kids went to the Catholic school boards and those sorts of things. The other was around the marketing of private schools themselves. Come to a private school and enjoy smaller class sizes. It's an entirely different conversation today. New parents coming into the school system who are looking at enrolling in kindergarten have class sizes of 18 kids now. And I think that this migration that happened to private education is over. And we should be looking at those enrollment trends. But it's incumbent on all of us who care about public education to believe in it from the perspective of how we're going to economically develop as a province, how we're going to advance an agenda of social justice and inclusion and respect for diversity and strengthen civil society in British Columbia, and all of those values that are included in public education. It's time for us to tell the great story of success that is public education and to work together on the things, the areas, the gaps that we find to make it even better. So that's our message to every stakeholder in the school system. Let's work on continuous improvement. Let's be bold, let's be ambitious. As we have been, one of the first things I was delighted to do as the minister was to abolish tuition fees brought in by the previous government for students involved in adult basic education. We've done that for children. And it's that kind of agenda that I think is going to restore public confidence, and it's public confidence that is deserved in public education systems. Thank you very much.
Questions from the audience. Are our school boards safe? Are elected local school boards safe in the eyes of this government?
Yes, I'm critically muted.
Is there a chance the government will restrict the use of FSA test data so that they can't be used for ranking our schools?
Yes, we're working on a way to do that. Privacy.
Will private school funding continue to be the largest growing line item in the K-12 budget?
Looking at the trends of students coming back into public education, I would say no, but check me in a year from now.
Well, I think what they're after is the rate of increase. You know, it's been creeping upward. The rate of increase has been faster than the rate of increase of funding to the public schools.
I think you're going to see that change, but the legislation, the law of the land is that every time we drive new investment, so we put $500 million more into public education, private education is a free rider on that. Literally, the Private School Education Act is bolted on to what we do in public education. So, well, I would urge everybody in the room with strong views on this to attend the meetings of the K-12 funding review and make your case known, because we're going to rely on that to make strong recommendations to the government.
Do you think the current policy of choice in the selection of schools serves to undermine the concept of community?
Yes or no question?
Does the current policy regarding choice in schools undermine the concept of community for British Columbia?
I don't think we're going to revisit the catchment issue anytime soon, if that is the question, as I understand it.
I'm going to give the questions to the minister to take with him.